The call came on a Tuesday morning in the third week of October, the kind of morning in rural Tennessee where the fog sits low over the fields and doesn't burn off until almost noon. Earl Badine's heart had given out sometime in the night. His body was found by his neighbor Dale, who had come over to return a pipe wrench he'd borrowed 6 weeks earlier and kept forgetting to bring back. His German shepherd had vanished from the property. But 3 weeks later, a woman 2 towns over called the non-emergency police line and said there was a large German shepherd sitting on the steps of the county courthouse, and he wouldn't leave. When the deputy ran the tag on his collar, she went very still. Then she called the dead man's eldest son. What that son found out over the next 72 hours didn't just explain why the dog was there. It unraveled everything the family thought they knew about their father's final years. Really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. Please leave a like and subscribe for more animal stories. Now let's continue. Earl Bodine had lived on those 11 acres outside Tullamore for 31 years. He and Marjorie had bought the property when their boys were still in grade school, back when land in that part of the county was cheap enough that an electrician and a school secretary could manage it on 2 modest incomes without stretching themselves too thin. They had put in a garden. They had fixed the farmhouse room by room over the years, slowly and with their own hands, the way people did things back then. They had raised Gary and Paul in that house, seen them graduate from Tullamore High, watched them drive away toward lives that took them further and further from that county road until the visits became holiday events and the phone calls became quarterly check-ins, and the distance between Nashville and Tullamore, and which was only 4 hours by interstate, became something much wider than geography. Marjorie died 8 years before Earl, a Tuesday as well. Earl had never much cared for Tuesdays after that, taken quickly by a stroke that gave no warning and asked no permission. The boys came home for the funeral and stayed 4 days and then drove back to Nashville, and Earl stood in the driveway and watched their taillights disappear and then walked back inside and sat in the kitchen in the quiet and began the long work of learning how to be alone in a house that had always been full. He was 66 years old. He had his pension, he had his garden, he had his tools and his routines, and his neighbor Dale and the people in town who knew him by name. He told everyone he was fine. He was, by certain measures, fine. But the house was quiet in a way it had never been before. And some rooms he stopped going into without quite deciding to. And the holidays got smaller every year. And some mornings he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and looked out at the fog on the fields and didn't move for a long time. It was Dale who suggested the dog. Not directly. Dale wasn't a man who pushed himself into other people's business. But he mentioned one evening over the fence that his cousin's shepherd had a litter, and he was going to take one himself, and did Earl want to come see them? Earl said he didn't need a dog. Dale said he didn't say anything about need. They went the following Saturday. Earl came home with an 8-week-old German shepherd with black saddle markings and one slightly bent ear and eyes the color of dark amber. He sat in the kitchen with the pup on his lap for most of that first evening, and by the time he went to bed, he had already named him Holt, after a stretch of creek that ran along the back of the property where he and Marjorie used to walk in the evenings when the boys were young. Over the next 5 years, Holt became the organizing principle of Earl's days in the way that only a dog can become for a person living alone. The morning walk along the property line happened every day without exception, rain or frost or summer heat that rose off the fields in visible waves. Earl talked to Holt the way he had never quite learned to talk to people, not in commands or baby talk, but in the steady, unhurried way of a man thinking out loud to someone he trusted completely. Surrey Holt listened with the full-body attention that German shepherds give to the people they have claimed, tracking Earl's movements around the property, sleeping across the doorway of whatever room Earl was in, riding in the passenger seat of the truck on errands with the easy confidence of an animal that has never once questioned whether it belongs. The woman at the feed store said Earl always bought the good food, the kind with the real meat listed first on the label, and he bought it every 2 weeks without fail. Dale said the only time in 9 years he had ever seen Earl truly laugh, not smile, not chuckle, but actually laugh the way a person does when something catches them completely off guard, was when Holt, at about age 2, got himself thoroughly outsmarted by a box turtle in the garden and spent 20 minutes circling it in bewildered offense. Gary and Paul knew about the dog the way they knew about most things in their father's life in those years. Abstractly, at a remove, through brief phone calls in which Earl answered questions about his health and the weather and the garden and volunteered almost nothing else. Gary had met Holt once, at Christmas 3 years before Earl died, and had thought of him as a large, calm animal that stayed close to his father and seemed well behaved. Paul had never visited during the years Earl had the dog. Paul's life in Nashville was busy in the way that some lives become busy as a kind of permanent condition, always something pressing. To always a reason the timing wasn't quite right for a 4-hour drive to a small farm in a county he had spent 20 years moving away from. Earl did not complain about this. That was the thing people in Tullamore would later say when the story came out and people started talking. Earl never complained. Not to Dale, not to the woman at the feed store, not to the people at the diner on Route 9 where he had breakfast on Friday mornings and where the waitress Dottie had known him for 15 years. He didn't talk about his sons much at all. If someone asked, he would say they were doing well, busy with their lives, and then he would change the subject or look out the window at the parking lot and the conversation would find its way somewhere else. What he did talk about in the last 2 or 3 years of his life was Carla Prentice. Not directly, not in a way that would have made anyone think twice at the time. He mentioned her the way you mention a neighbor, casually in passing, as part of the fabric of daily life. He told Dale once that he'd taken some firewood down the road to Carla because her wood pile was getting low and she didn't have anyone to help her with it. He told Dottie at the diner that he'd had to reschedule his Friday breakfast one week because Carla's truck wouldn't start and she had a doctor's appointment in Cookville and he was going to drive her. Small things, neighborly things. The kind of things people in rural counties did for each other as a matter of course, or used to, and Earl was the kind of man who did them without announcement or expectation of acknowledgement. Carla Prentice was 68 years old, a widow of 4 years who lived about 1.5 miles down the county road from Earl in a white farmhouse with a green metal roof that her late husband Gerald had put on the year before he died. She had 2 grown children in other states who called on Sundays and visited in summer. She had a small fixed income and a truck that was 10 years old and a furnace that the repairman had told her 2 winters ago was on its last legs. She was not in crisis exactly, but she was living in that particular condition of rural elderhood, where the margin between managing and not managing is thinner than it looks from the outside, and where the difference between those 2 states is often determined by whether or not there is someone nearby who pays attention. Earl paid attention. He had been paying attention, it would turn out, for nearly 3 years before he died, quietly, consistently, without making it a story or a gesture or something that required thanks. He bought her groceries on his own runs to the store when he knew she was running low. He called Dale one Saturday morning and asked him, without much explanation, if he could come over and look at Carla's fence line because a section had come down and she had a kitchen garden she was worried about. Dale fixed the fence. Earl paid him for the materials and Dale tried to give the money back, and Earl wouldn't take it. 2 winters running, Earl had called the propane company and the electric utility and paid Carla's heating bills directly, in full, without telling her. She found out about the first one by accident when she called to ask about a discrepancy on her statement, and she drove over to Earl's that afternoon and stood on his porch and told him he had no business doing that. Earl said he had some business, probably. She stood there for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you," and drove home. And after that, they had a kind of understanding between them that required very little discussion and suited them both exactly. What nobody knew, not Dale, not Dottie, not Gary or Paul, was that Earl had also been making trips to the county courthouse in Tullamore over the course of the last 2 years of his life. 11 trips in 22 months. He drove in on weekday mornings, parked in the lot behind the building, walked up the front steps with Holt beside him, left the dog on the bench outside the main entrance, went in to see the county clerk, conducted his business, and came back out. Holt was always in the same spot. Earl would sit on the bench with him for a few minutes before they drove home, the way a man does when he has just taken care of something that needed taking care of, and is letting himself sit with the satisfaction of that for a moment before moving on to the next thing. The county clerk's name was Helen. She was 53, had worked in that office for 16 years, and was the kind of public servant who understood that her job required discretion as much as it required competence. She knew Earl Bodine by his third visit. She knew why he kept coming back. She processed his paperwork each time with professional efficiency and said nothing to anyone, because it was not her business to say anything to anyone. And because Earl had never asked her to keep his visits confidential, but carried himself in a way that made it clear he was not advertising them either. He amended his will 4 times in those 2 years. Each amendment was modest, deliberate, and entirely legal. He was not confused. He was not being manipulated. He had thought all of it through with the same patient thoroughness he brought to electrical work, identifying the problem clearly, determining the right approach, executing it carefully, checking it twice. He had consulted a lawyer in Cookville on 2 occasions to make sure the documents would hold. The lawyer had no concerns. Earl was competent, clear-eyed, and knew exactly what he wanted to do with what he had. The final version of the will left 3 of his 11 acres, along with a small cash sum, to Carla Prentice. In the remaining 8 acres and the farmhouse and its contents were to be transferred to a land conservation trust he had identified and contacted 18 months before his death, an organization that worked with rural landowners in Middle Tennessee to preserve working farmland and keep it from being subdivided or developed. Earl had visited their office in person once, driven the 90 minutes each way himself, talked with their director for 2 hours, gone home, thought about it for 3 weeks, and then called back and said he wanted to move forward. The trust had handled the paperwork. Helen had filed it. Earl had signed everything that needed signing and driven home, and not mentioned it to anyone. He had also, on his final visit to Helen's office, filed a handwritten letter with the will. It was addressed to Gary and Paul. Helen had read it in the course of processing the filing, as was her practice with handwritten documents submitted for the record. It was 11 sentences. She had thought about those 11 sentences on and off in the 2 months between Earl's last visit and the morning Dale found him in the hallway. When Earl died and Gary was called and came up that evening, he put Holt in the laundry room and made phone calls, and by the next morning, the dog was gone. Gary posted a flyer at the gas station on his way out of town and figured that was that. Holt walked 18 miles, the best reconstruction anyone could manage later, piecing together sightings from people along the county roads who had noticed a large German shepherd moving with clear purpose and no apparent distress. It was that Holt left the Bodine property sometime in the early morning hours after Gary's departure, crossed the creek at the low point near the back fence, picked up the road heading toward town, and walked. He avoided the interstate. He stayed to the county roads and the field margins, the kinds of paths a dog learns over years of riding in a truck and watching the landscape go by from the passenger window and building, in whatever way dogs build such things, a map of the world around the person they belong to. It took him most of 2 days. A woman outside the town of Cartwell, 12 miles from Tullamore, saw him resting in a ditch on the second morning and put a bowl of water out. He drank it and moved on. He arrived at the courthouse on a Thursday. He went up the front steps and sat down in front of the main entrance. Not on the bench where he used to wait for Earl. The bench was to the left of the doors, but directly in front of the doors themselves, as if he was not waiting this time, but presenting himself. As if he had come with something to say and intended to be heard. He was there for 3 days before the right person noticed. The call came in on a Saturday morning, placed by a woman named Roberta, who worked at the insurance office across the street and had been watching the dog for 2 days and finally decided that someone official should know about it. The deputy dispatcher sent Lena Marsh because Lena was closest, and it was a quiet morning. Lena had grown up in Tullamore, had gone to school with Paul Badine's youngest kid back when Paul still came home for summers, when I knew the family name the way you know names in a small county. Not intimately, but as part of the permanent background of the place. She pulled into the courthouse lot, got out of her cruiser, and stood looking at the German shepherd on the steps for a moment before approaching. He watched her come. He didn't move. She noted his size, his condition. He was thin but not starved. His coat was dry, his eyes were clear, and the quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of exhaustion or fear, but of intention. She checked his tag. She ran the registration. She stood very still herself for a moment when the result came back. Then she called Gary Bodine in Nashville. Gary said the dog had been missing for 3 weeks and he'd posted a flyer. Lena said she understood that, but she thought Gary might want to come up. Gary asked why. Lena paused and said she thought it would be better to talk in person. There was something in her voice, not alarm exactly, but a kind of careful steadiness that made Gary set down what he was doing and tell his wife he needed to drive to Tullamore. While she waited, Lena sat on the courthouse steps beside Holt. She had brought a water bottle and she poured some into her cupped hand and he drank it. She sat there through the rest of her shift and into the early afternoon, and she asked questions of the people who passed. Regulars, county employees, retirees who came to the benches on the courthouse lawn in good weather. And it was Bev, the clerk who had worked in the building for 22 years, who gave her the piece that mattered. Bev had come out with her lunch and stopped on the steps and looked at the dog for a long moment and said she knew that dog. Said he used to come with Earl Bodine. Said Earl would leave him right here and go in to see Helen, and on the way out he'd always sit a spell before driving home. Bev said Earl was a good man and she was sorry about his passing. Then she went and sat on the bench and ate her lunch, and Lena went inside. Helen told her everything, not because she was required to, and not because she was eager to be part of whatever was unfolding, but because Lena was a deputy asking questions in an official capacity, and because Helen had been sitting with the weight of what she knew for 8 weeks, and Earl was gone now, and there was no one left to protect except the truth of what he had intended. She brought out the folder. She walked Lena through each visit, each amendment, the deed transfer, the conservation trust agreement, the timeline of it all. She described Earl's demeanor, unhurried, clear, consistent, and the lawyer consultations, and the final visit 2 months before his death when he had filed the letter. She gave Lena a copy of the letter. She watched Lena read it and saw her read it again. Then Helen put the folder back in its place and folded her hands on her desk and said that she hoped everything would be handled the way Earl meant it to be handled. Lena said she hoped so too. Gary arrived in Tullamore the following morning. He had called Paul the evening before, and the call had not gone well. Paul had immediately begun talking about undue influence, about their father's isolation, about the legal definition of testamentary capacity in Tennessee, about the attorney he already knew who handled estate disputes and who had said, on a preliminary call that evening, that there were grounds to at least explore a challenge. Gary had listened and said very little, and by the end of the call had not committed to anything, which Paul took as agreement and Gary knew was not. He parked in the courthouse lot. He sat in his car for a while. Through the windshield he could see Holt on the steps, and he watched the dog for several minutes before getting out. Holt watched him cross the parking lot. Tonight, Gary stopped at the base of the steps. The dog looked at him with the amber eyes, and Gary had a feeling he couldn't have articulated precisely, a feeling of being assessed by something that did not have language but did not need it. He sat down on the steps next to the dog. Holt did not move toward him or away from him. Gary put his hand out and Holt sniffed it and then looked back at the courthouse doors, and Gary sat there and tried to think clearly. He had not known this dog. He had not known really much about his father's days in recent years. He had told himself his father was fine because his father said he was fine, and he had accepted that because it was convenient to accept it, and because the alternative, sitting with the knowledge that his father was alone in that farmhouse, that the holidays were shrinking, in it that the distance was real and not just geographical, was not something he had been willing to sit with. He sat with it now, on the courthouse steps, next to the dog that had walked 18 miles to be in the place where his father went when something mattered. He went inside and asked Helen for the letter. He read it standing at the counter. Earl's handwriting was the careful, slightly oversized print of a man who had learned penmanship before anyone questioned whether penmanship mattered, and who had maintained it as a point of quiet pride his whole life. The letter was addressed to Gary and Paul by name. It said that he hoped they were well and that he was sorry he hadn't been better at saying the things that needed saying while there was still time to say them in person. It said that the farm had been a good place to live a life, and he hoped it would go on being a good place for other things to grow. It said that Carla Prentice was a good woman who had let him be useful to someone at a time when being useful to someone had kept him going in ways he couldn't fully explain, and that he was grateful for that. It said that he didn't blame his sons for living their lives because that was what he and Marjorie had raised them to do. And then it said, and these were the two sentences Gary would tell Dale about later, the two sentences that finished him right there at the county clerk's counter, that a life lived quietly in service to the people around you was not a small life, no matter how it looked from the outside, and that he hoped someday his sons would find that out for themselves. The last sentence said he loved them and always had. Then it was signed Earl, just Earl, the way he signed everything. Gary stood at the counter for a while after he finished reading. Helen waited. She did not rush him. Eventually, he folded the letter and handed it back to her and thanked her and walked outside. He sat on the bench next to Holt, the bent ear, the amber eyes, the dog that had come here because this was where Earl went when something mattered, and Holt had understood, in whatever way he understood things, that whatever his owner had been doing here for 2 years had been important, had been the kind of important that deserved a witness, and so he had come to bear witness to it in the only way available to him. Gary called Paul that evening from the parking lot, and Paul started talking about the attorney before Gary had finished his first sentence. Gary let him talk. Then he said he had read the letter. Paul said the letter didn't change the legal question. Gary said he wasn't talking about the legal question. Paul said the will could be challenged and there were grounds, and Gary was letting sentiment override his judgment. Gary said maybe sentiment was exactly the right thing to let override his judgment this one time. Paul said Gary was making a mistake. Gary said probably he'd made enough of them already, that one more in the right direction wouldn't hurt. Paul was quiet for a moment. Gary told him about the 11 visits, about the deed transfer, about the heating bills, about Carla Prentice standing on Earl's porch telling him he had no business doing that, and Earl saying he had some business. Probably about the conservation trust in the 90-minute drive each way, and the 2-hour meeting, and the 3 weeks of thinking, and the call back. About Holt on the courthouse steps, about the bench, about the 18 miles. Paul didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said he needed to think. Gary said that was fine. They hung up and Gary sat in the parking lot in the dark, and Holt was still on the steps, and the courthouse was closed now, and the lot was empty, and the fog was coming in off the fields again, the way it did in October in that county, low and slow and patient. Paul called back 2 days later and said he had dismissed the attorney. He didn't explain his reasoning, and Gary didn't ask. The will stood. The deed transfer was executed. Carla Prentice came to the county clerk's office on a Wednesday morning and signed the paperwork transferring 3 acres to her name, and then sat in her truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes before driving home. She did not speak publicly about any of it for a long time, and when she finally did, in a brief conversation with Dale the following spring, she said only that Earl had been a good neighbor and that the world had fewer of those than it used to, and she was going to do her best to deserve what he'd left her. The Conservation Trust took possession of the 8 acres and the farmhouse in late November. Their director drove out from their office to walk the property and spent 2 hours on it, and afterwards she told her colleague on the phone that it was good land, well kept, the kind of land that remembered being cared for. They had plans for a native plant restoration on the back section near the creek and a potential partnership with a local school for outdoor education programming. They were going to keep the farmhouse as a field station. The garden Earl had maintained for 30 years they intended to keep going. Lena Marsh found a home for Holt with Dale, who had not needed to be asked twice. Dale said yes before Lena had finished the sentence. He drove into Tullamore and picked the dog up from the courthouse steps himself, and Holt got into the truck the way he had gotten into Earl's truck 10,000 times before, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like trucks were for riding in, and he had somewhere to be. Dale drove him home. That evening they walked the property line, to Dale on the outside of the fence and Holt ranging along the Bodine side, the way things had been for years, except now Dale was walking the whole length instead of just nodding from his own yard. They did it again the next morning. They have done it every morning since. The plaque on the courthouse bench was Lena's idea. suggested at a county commission meeting 4 months after Earl died. It was a small thing, a modest bronze rectangle attached to the back of the bench slats, and the commission approved it without much discussion because nobody had any objection, and several members remembered Earl and thought it was fitting. It says his name and the years he lived and nothing else. People in Tullamore know what it's there for. Bev knows. Helen knows. It's Dottie at the diner knows and sometimes tells a story to people who are passing through and stop for coffee and ask about it when they come back from the courthouse and see the bench. The story takes a while to tell properly. Most people who hear it stay for a second cup. On the first Saturday of every month, Dale drives into Tullamore in the morning with Holt in the passenger seat and parks in the courthouse lot, and they sit on the bench together for a while. Not for any particular reason that Dale has ever tried to explain. Just because it seems like the kind of thing that should be continued. Because Earl sat there. Because Holt sat there. Because some things deserve to be kept up even after the person who started them is gone. Especially those things. And especially when the keeping up costs you nothing but a little time on a Saturday morning in a town where the fog is burning off the fields and the day is just beginning, and a good dog is sitting beside you in the October light, looking at the courthouse doors with those amber eyes, patient as ever, waiting for nothing and honoring everything. There is a kind of loyalty the world struggles to name, the kind that operates without audience, without reward, without any expectation of being understood. Earl Bodine had it. He gave it to Carla Prentice without asking anything in return. He gave it to the land that had held his family for 3 decades. He put it into 11 careful visits to a county clerk's office over 2 years, it building something true and lasting out of nothing more than attention and intention and the willingness to show up. And Holt had it too, in the way dogs carry it when they have been loved well by someone worth loving. Not as a concept, not as a choice, but as a fact of their nature, as automatic and absolute as breathing. He walked 18 miles because his person had gone somewhere important and he needed to be there too. That is the whole of it. That is enough. Gary Bodine sold his house in Nashville 14 months after his father died and bought a place in Cookeville, 40 minutes from Tullamore. He has breakfast at the diner on Route 9 on Friday mornings now. Dottie knows his name. He is learning, he told Dale one afternoon over the fence line, how to be useful to the people around him. Dale said that was a good thing to learn. And Gary said he probably should have learned it sooner. Dale said most people said that, and the ones who said it and meant it were the ones who actually changed, and that was something. Gary nodded and looked out over the fields for a while. Then he said he was going to start coming on the Saturday mornings, if Dale didn't mind the company on the walk. Dale said he didn't mind at all. Holt looked up at Gary with the amber eyes, the bent ear, the dark patience of a dog who has already waited longer than most people could bear, and would wait longer still, and counts none of it as a burden. Gary reached down and put his hand on the dog's back, and they stood there in the morning light, the 3 of them, on the good land beside the creek that still carries the name Earl gave his dog. Well, the name of the place where things were quiet and the water ran clear, and 2 people used to walk in the evenings a long time ago, before the world got complicated, before the distance grew, before all the Tuesdays that followed the worst one, and will keep running long after all of them are gone, the way water does, the way loyalty does, without end and without explanation and without asking anyone's permission to continue. Before you go, Dale never told Gary what Earl said to him the morning after Marjorie's funeral. The morning the boys had already left and the house was quiet again, and Earl came over to the fence line and stood there for a while without saying much. Dale had waited, and eventually Earl said that the hardest part wasn't the grief. So the hardest part was realizing that the people who should have stayed the longest were the ones who left the fastest. He didn't say it with anger. He said it the way Earl said most things, quietly looking out at the fields, like he was just noticing the weather. Dale never repeated it to anyone, not to Lena, not to Dottie, not to Gary. Some things a man tells you at a fence line are not yours to pass on, but he thought about it the morning Gary showed up for the first Saturday walk. He thought about it when Gary put his hand on Holt's back. He didn't say anything. He just opened the gate. Now it's your turn. Did Gary deserve that second chance? Or did Earl's silence cost him the wake-up call he needed years earlier? Drop your answer below. And if this story hit you somewhere deep, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. You might not know who that person is, but they'll know when they do.